The fluorescent lights of San Francisco International Airport buzzed overhead as hundreds of tired travelers shuffled through Terminal 3. It was one of those typical Tuesday afternoons, where everyone seemed to be running late, dragging oversized suitcases and clutching crumpled boarding passes. The air smelled like stale coffee and recycled air conditioning, mixed with that distinct airport scent that somehow exists in every terminal across the world. Officer Derek Mitchell stood near the security checkpoint, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack a walnut. At 42 years old, he'd been on the force for nearly 2 decades, and today felt like the culmination of every frustration he'd built up over the years. Just 3 days ago, he'd watched a younger officer get the promotion he'd been gunning for. The same promotion he'd sacrificed weekends and holidays to earn. And this morning, his lawyer had called with news about his divorce settlement that made his stomach turn. Now here he was, assigned to what he considered glorified babysitting duty at the airport. Security detail, the kind of assignment they give to rookies or officers being punished. Derek had always prided himself on being a real cop, the kind who handled serious crimes and commanded respect. Standing around watching tourists fumble with their laptops and liquids in plastic bags felt like the ultimate insult. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hand resting on his belt in that casual but authoritative way officers do. His partner for the day, Officer Kevin Park, was making small talk with one of the TSA agents. But Derek wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. He wanted this shift to end so he could go home, crack open a beer, and forget about his crumbling life for a few hours. That's when he noticed him. A man in his mid-40s was walking through the customs area, pulling a modest black suitcase behind him. He wore a simple button-down shirt that looked like it had seen better days, slightly wrinkled from the long flight. His medical bag hung across his shoulder, worn at the edges from years of use. But it wasn't the bag or the wrinkled shirt that caught Derek's attention. It was something else, something he couldn't quite put his finger on but felt justified in noting. The man looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed his eyes and his movements were slow, deliberate like someone running on empty. Dr. Antonio Cruz had every reason to be tired. He'd just spent the last 2 weeks in Manila, working 16-hour days at a children's hospital where he'd volunteered his skills as a heart surgeon. 14 kids had gone home with repaired hearts because of him. 14 families who couldn't afford the surgery had watched their children get a second chance at life. But Derek didn't know any of that. All he saw was a tired-looking guy with a foreign passport and wrinkled clothes. And in Derek's current state of mind, that was enough. Antonio made his way toward the exit, thinking about nothing more than getting home to his small apartment in Palo Alto, taking a hot shower, and sleeping for about 12 hours straight. He'd promised his elderly mother he'd call when he landed, and he was already composing the conversation in his head. She always worried when he traveled, especially to the Philippines. She'd emigrated from there 40 years ago, worked 2 jobs to put him through school, and never quite stopped treating him like he was still 10 years old. "Sir, step over here, please." The voice cut through Antonio's tired thoughts. He looked up to see Officer Derek Mitchell gesturing toward him with an expression that didn't invite questions. "Me?" Antonio asked, glancing around to make sure the officer wasn't talking to someone else. "Yes, you. Step aside for additional screening." Derek's tone left no room for discussion. Antonio felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. He'd been through this before. Random selections that didn't feel quite so random. But he was too tired to be anything other than compliant. He wheeled his suitcase toward the officer, offering a small, polite smile. "Is there a problem, officer?" "That's what we're going to find out," Derek replied, his eyes scanning Antonio up and down in a way that made the doctor feel like he was being measured and found wanting. "ID and passport." Antonio reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet, extracting his driver's license and the dark blue passport. His hands were steady despite the anxiety creeping up his spine. Years of performing delicate surgeries had trained him to stay calm under pressure, but this was different. In the operating room, he had control. Here, he had none. Derek took the documents without a thank you, flipping through the passport pages with exaggerated slowness. He noted the stamps from the Philippines, Thailand, and several other countries where Antonio had done medical mission work over the years. "You travel a lot," Derek observed, his tone making it sound like an accusation rather than a statement. "I volunteer at hospitals overseas," Antonio explained quietly. "Medical missions. I'm a cardiac surgeon, Derek's expression didn't change. If anything, his jaw tightened further. Sure you are. The dismissiveness in those 3 words hit Antonio harder than he expected. He'd heard that tone before, that subtle implication that he was lying, that someone who looked like him couldn't possibly be telling the truth about being a successful doctor. It was the same tone he'd encountered as a medical student when attending physicians assumed he was an orderly. The same tone he'd heard at conferences when people were surprised he was presenting research rather than serving drinks. I have my medical credentials in my bag if you'd like to see them, Antonio offered, keeping his voice level and respectful. I didn't ask for that, Derek snapped. Put your bag on the table. Empty your pockets. Antonio complied, placing his medical bag on the metal table and removing his wallet, phone, and keys from his pockets. His movements were slow and deliberate, the way you move when you're afraid that anything sudden might be misinterpreted. By now, a few other travelers had started to notice. A young woman with a backpack slowed her pace, her eyes darting between Antonio and the officer. An elderly couple paused their conversation to watch. This wasn't the usual random screening everyone was used to seeing. There was an edge to it, a tension that made people uncomfortable. Officer Kevin Park finished his conversation with the TSA agent and walked over, sensing something off in his partner's demeanor. Everything okay here, Derek? Just doing a routine check, Derek replied without looking at him. He was focused on Antonio's medical bag now, unzipping it with rough movements that made the doctor wince. Inside were the tools of Antonio's trade, surgical instruments carefully wrapped in sterile packaging, medical journals with pages marked and annotated, a stethoscope that had been a gift from his mother when he graduated medical school. There were also folders containing certificates and photographs from his recent trip. Pictures of him with children in hospital beds, their post-surgery smiles lighting up the frames. Letters of appreciation from the hospital director. His credentials from Stanford Medical Center where he taught when he wasn't in the operating room or flying overseas to help those who couldn't afford his expertise. Derek pulled items out carelessly, his frustration with his own life manifesting in the way he handled someone else's belongings. A packet of surgical gloves fell to the floor, paper scattered across the table. Sir, please be careful with those, Antonio said, his voice still calm but with an edge of concern. Some of that equipment is very expensive and delicate. Don't tell me how to do my job, Derek shot back. The young woman with the backpack had her phone out now, partially hidden but clearly recording. She wasn't the only one. In the age of viral videos and social media justice, people had learned to document these moments. They'd seen too many stories where someone's word against an officer's meant nothing without proof. Antonio noticed the phones but said nothing. Part of him was grateful. Another part was deeply embarrassed that it had come to this, that simply trying to get home after 2 weeks of saving children's lives had turned into a spectacle. Why are you traveling with all this medical equipment? Derek demanded, holding up a package of sterile sutures like it was evidence of wrongdoing. Because I'm a doctor, Antonio repeated, his patience wearing thin despite his best efforts. I was doing volunteer surgery in the Philippines, at a children's hospital. You got documentation for all this equipment? You can't just bring medical supplies across international borders without proper paperwork. Antonio felt his heart rate pick up. Yes, I have all the proper documentation. Everything was cleared through customs. If you look in the front pocket of that bag, there's a folder with all the declarations and approvals. Derek either didn't hear him or chose not to. He was on a roll now, his bad day finding a convenient target. He grabbed Antonio's arm, his grip tighter than necessary. I think we need to take you in for further questioning. For what? Antonio asked, his calm finally cracking. I've done nothing wrong. I've answered all your questions. My documents are in order. Don't raise your voice at me, Derek warned, his own voice rising. I'm not raising my voice, I'm asking a legitimate question. Why am I being detained? Officer Kevin Park stepped closer, his hand raised in a calming gesture. Hey, let's all just take a breath here. Derek, maybe we should... Stay out of this, Kevin, Derek cut him off. The crowd of onlookers was growing now. Some people had stopped completely, forming a loose semicircle around the scene. Their faces showed varying degrees of concern, confusion, and recognition. A few seemed to know exactly what they were witnessing, the kind of profiling and escalation that had become all too familiar in news cycles and social media feeds. Antonio's mind was racing. He'd been awake for nearly 20 hours. He had bruised ribs from leaning over operating tables. His back ached, his feet hurt, and all he wanted was to go home. But he also knew that showing frustration or anger could make this situation spiral out of control. He'd had the conversation with enough friends and colleagues to know that staying calm, staying compliant was the only play here, even if it meant swallowing his pride and accepting treatment he didn't deserve. "Officer, I'm happy to cooperate," Antonio said, forcing his voice back to that careful, measured tone. "But I need to understand what I'm being accused of. I'm a United States citizen. I'm a doctor. I have done nothing illegal. Everything in my possession is legal and documented." Derek's face flushed red. Something about Antonio's calm, reasonable response made him even angrier. Maybe it was the implicit contrast to his own lack of control. Maybe it was the way the doctor's quiet dignity highlighted Derek's own unprofessionalism. Or maybe it was just that Derek had been looking for an outlet for his rage all day. And this man had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Derek said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can just talk your way out of this?" Kevin Park's expression shifted from concern to alarmed. "Derek, seriously, let's just—" What happened next occurred so quickly that several witnesses would later give conflicting accounts of exactly how it started. Derek grabbed Antonio's shoulder and spun him around. Antonio, caught off balance after standing for so long on an international flight, stumbled slightly. Derek interpreted the stumble as resistance. In a motion that was part training and part anger, Derek shoved Antonio toward the wall. The doctor's medical bag fell from the table, instruments scattering across the polished airport floor with a series of metallic clinks that sounded impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Antonio's shoulder hit the wall with a thud. Pain shot through his already exhausted body. Around them, several people gasped. Phones that had been partially hidden were now openly recording, their owners no longer pretending to be casual bystanders. And in that moment, Officer Derek Mitchell made a choice that would change multiple lives forever. Instead of stepping back, instead of listening to his partner's increasingly urgent voice, instead of noticing the crowd or the cameras or the fact that the man he was confronting had done absolutely nothing to warrant this treatment, Derek let his worst impulses take over. He pressed his forearm against Antonio's back, forcing him against the wall with unnecessary pressure. "You're under detention for suspicious behavior and failure to comply with a security officer." Antonio's cheek was pressed against the cold wall, his mind struggling to process how quickly everything had gone wrong. Just minutes ago, he'd been looking forward to his mother's voice on the phone, to his own bed, to the simple pleasure of being home. Now he was being physically restrained in an airport, surrounded by strangers with cameras for reasons he still didn't fully understand. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort, or even the fear. It was the humiliation. The absolute degradation of being treated like a criminal in front of dozens of people when he'd spent the last 2 weeks quite literally saving lives. Kevin Park had his radio out now, calling for a supervisor. His face showed clear distress, torn between backing his partner and doing what was obviously right. Several TSA agents had gathered, their expressions ranging from shock to carefully maintained neutrality. And somewhere in that crowd, multiple phones were capturing every second, uploading to social media in real time, beginning a chain of events that would reach far beyond Terminal 3 of San Francisco International Airport. The cold airport floor pressed against Antonio's cheek as Derek forced him down. One moment he'd been standing, trying to reason with an increasingly aggressive officer, and the next his knees had buckled under the pressure of hands pushing him downward. The scattered surgical instruments from his bag glinted under the harsh terminal lights. Expensive tools he'd carefully maintained for years now lying among dirty shoe prints and discarded gum wrappers. "I'm not resisting," Antonio managed to say. His voice strained but still remarkably controlled. Years of staying calm during medical emergencies had trained him for high-pressure situations, but nothing had quite prepared him for this. "Please, you're hurting me." Derek wasn't listening. His knee pressed into Antonio's back, right between the shoulder blades as he fumbled for his handcuffs. The doctor's arms were pulled behind him with enough force to make his shoulders scream in protest. The metallic click of the cuffs closing around his wrists seemed to echo through the terminal, a sound that made several onlookers flinch. "Derek, stop!" Kevin Park's voice cut through the commotion, louder and more forceful than before. He grabbed his partner's shoulder, trying to pull him back. "This isn't right. Look at what you're doing." I said stay out of this, Derek growled. But there was something in his voice now. A slight waver that suggested maybe, just maybe, some part of his brain was starting to recognize he'd crossed a line. A middle-aged woman in a business suit pushed through the growing crowd. I'm recording this, she announced loudly, holding her phone up. Everyone can see what's happening here. This man did nothing wrong. Ma'am, step back, Derek ordered, but his authority was crumbling. More phones were out now, at least a dozen pointing in his direction. The age of accountability had arrived, and it was equipped with HD cameras and instant upload capabilities. Antonio focused on breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the same way he coached nervous patients before surgery. The pressure on his back was making it difficult, and his wrist, the same one he used to perform delicate heart surgeries, was already starting to throb from the tight handcuffs. He wondered briefly, almost absurdly, whether he'd be able to operate tomorrow if there was permanent damage. What's going on here? The new voice carried immediate authority. Lieutenant Raymond Foster had been alerted by Kevin's radio call and had made it from the security office in record time. At 56, with nearly 3 decades on the force, Raymond had seen enough situations spiral out of control to recognize one from 50 feet away. What he saw as he approached made his blood run cold. An officer kneeling on a well-dressed civilian who was clearly offering no resistance. A crowd of at least 30 people, many filming, scattered medical equipment that even from a distance looked expensive and professional. And Derek Mitchell, his face red and his movements jerky with adrenaline, looking like a man who'd just realized he might have made a terrible mistake but was too proud to admit it. Officer Mitchell, step back now. Raymond's voice wasn't loud, but it carried the kind of weight that made people obey without thinking. Derek looked up, and for a moment something like relief crossed his face. Maybe he wanted someone to stop him. Maybe some part of him had been screaming that this was wrong from the beginning. He stood up slowly, stepping away from Antonio but not removing the handcuffs. Raymond knelt beside the doctor, his movements careful and deliberate. Sir, are you injured? My wrist, Antonio said quietly. And my ribs. But I'll be okay. Can you please just tell me what's happening? I don't understand what I did wrong. The simple, confused question hit Raymond harder than any accusation could have. He'd heard that tone before, from people who genuinely had no idea why they were being targeted. It was different from the defensive anger of someone who knew they were guilty. This was just bewilderment mixed with pain. Let's get these cuffs off, Raymond said, producing his own key. As he unlocked them, he noticed the redness already forming on Antonio's wrists, the way the doctor winced as circulation returned. Kevin, get the medical kit. I'm fine, Antonio insisted, though his voice said otherwise. He sat up slowly, cradling his right wrist. I just want to know what I'm being charged with. You're not being charged with anything, Raymond said firmly. He shot a look at Derek that could have melted steel. This was a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? The woman in the business suit stepped forward, her phone still recording. I watched the whole thing. This officer assaulted that man for no reason. We all saw it. Raymond held up a hand. Ma'am, I understand your concern. I assure you this will be investigated fully. For now, I need to make sure this gentleman is okay. He turned back to Antonio. Sir, what's your name? Dr. Antonio Cruz. He said it quietly without emphasis, but Raymond caught the title. You're a doctor? Cardiovascular surgeon. I teach at Stanford Medical Center. Antonio gestured weakly toward his scattered belongings. I was coming back from a medical mission in Manila. 2 weeks of volunteer surgery at a children's hospital. I just want to go home. Raymond's expression shifted as the full picture started coming together. He looked at the medical equipment on the floor, really looked at it this time. Those weren't basic first aid supplies. That was specialized surgical equipment, the kind that cost thousands of dollars per piece. He picked up one of the certificates that had fallen from Antonio's bag, and his stomach sank. It was a letter of commendation from the Philippine Department of Health, thanking Dr. Antonio Cruz for his invaluable contribution to pediatric cardiac care and noting that his volunteer efforts resulted in 14 successful surgeries that gave children a new lease on life. Oh no, Raymond breathed. Kevin Park had been gathering the scattered instruments, handling them carefully now that he understood what they were. He picked up a photograph that had slipped from a folder. It showed Antonio in surgical scrubs, surrounded by smiling children in hospital beds. The kids were holding up drawings they'd made, colorful pictures of hearts and rainbows and stick figures of doctors. "Derek," Kevin said, his voice hollow. "You need to see this." But Derek had already seen enough. He stood frozen, watching as Raymond helped Antonio to his feet, as the crowd's murmuring grew louder and more hostile, as the reality of what he'd done began to sink in. This wasn't some suspicious character. This was a respected surgeon, an educator, a humanitarian who spent his free time saving children's lives for free. Antonio swayed slightly once he was standing, and Raymond steadied him. "We need to get you checked out by medical services." "I'm a doctor," Antonio said with the ghost of a smile. "I can assess myself. Bruised ribs, sprained wrist, nothing that won't heal. But my equipment—" He looked at the instruments scattered across the floor, some of them now stepped on by the crowd, possibly damaged beyond repair. "Some of those tools cost more than most people make in a month. We'll replace anything that's damaged," Raymond promised, though he knew that wasn't really the point. "Sir, I am deeply sorry for what happened here. This should never have occurred. Why did it occur?" Antonio asked, and there was no anger in the question, just genuine confusion. "I showed my passport. I answered questions. I was polite. I offered to show my credentials. What about me seemed threatening enough to warrant being thrown to the ground and handcuffed?" The question hung in the air, and everyone knew the answer even if no one wanted to say it out loud. Raymond had been on the force long enough to know profiling when he saw it. He'd fought against it his entire career, had written policy recommendations and conducted training sessions, and yet, here it was again, playing out in front of dozens of witnesses and countless cameras. "There's no good answer to that question," Raymond said honestly, "but I promise you this will be addressed." "Will it?" The business suit woman hadn't put her phone down. "Because I've seen these misunderstandings before. Usually nothing happens. The officer gets a slap on the wrist, maybe some paid leave, and then it's back to business as usual." She wasn't wrong, and Raymond knew it, but he also knew that this time was different. This time there were videos from multiple angles. This time the victim was someone whose reputation and credentials were impeccable. This time the evidence was overwhelming. A TSA supervisor had arrived with the medical kit, and despite Antonio's protests, Raymond insisted he at least let someone look at his wrist. While a paramedic who'd been called to the scene examined him, Raymond picked up Antonio's belongings, carefully placing each instrument back in the medical bag with a reverence that acknowledged their purpose and value. He found Antonio's wallet and looked at the driver's license. The address was in Palo Alto, one of the nicer areas. He found business cards identifying Antonio as an associate professor of cardiothoracic surgery at Stanford. He found a worn photograph of an elderly woman, probably Antonio's mother, tucked behind the license. Kevin Park approached Raymond, his face pale. "The videos are already online. I just checked Twitter. There are at least 5 different angles being shared, and they're spreading fast." Raymond closed his eyes briefly. Of course they were. In the time it had taken to get Antonio medical attention, the incident had probably already reached thousands of people. By tomorrow it would be hundreds of thousands. By the end of the week, millions. "Has anyone contacted media relations?" Raymond asked. "I called it in," Kevin confirmed. "They're sending someone." "But Raymond, this is bad. Really bad." "The optics alone." "The optics?" Raymond's voice hardened. "Kevin, forget the optics. A respected surgeon was assaulted by one of our officers for no reason. That's not an optics problem. That's a justice problem." Derek had been standing to the side, and now he stepped forward. For the first time since the confrontation began, he looked directly at Antonio. I didn't know. You should have told me you were a doctor." The statement was so absurd that several people in the crowd actually laughed. Antonio just looked at him, his expression unreadable. "I did tell you," Antonio said quietly. "Multiple times. You didn't believe me. And even if I wasn't a doctor, even if I was just a regular person coming home from a trip, would that have made this okay?" Derek opened his mouth but found he had no answer. Because Antonio was right. The fact that he turned out to be a prominent surgeon made the headlines worse, but it didn't make the fundamental injustice any different. Every person deserved to be treated with basic dignity and respect, regardless of their profession or background. The paramedic finished examining Antonio's wrist and confirmed what the doctor had already diagnosed himself. Sprained, not broken, but he should ice it and keep it elevated. The ribs were bruised but not fractured. He'd be sore for a few days, maybe a week, but there was no permanent damage. At least not physically. Am I free to go? Antonio asked Raymond. Of course. You were always free to go. You did nothing wrong. Raymond pulled out his business card and handed it to Antonio. Please take this. We'll need your statement and you'll want to be in touch about filing a complaint. I'll also need your contact information for our investigation. Antonio took the card but didn't look at it. I just want to go home. I understand. But Dr. Cruz, what happened to you today matters, not just for you, but for the next person who might be in your position. Your voice could help prevent this from happening to someone else. It was the right thing to say. Despite his exhaustion and pain, despite wanting nothing more than to forget this entire experience, Antonio knew Raymond was right. He thought about the children he'd just spent 2 weeks helping. Kids who'd been born into circumstances they didn't choose but who deserved a chance anyway. This was different but somehow the same. Circumstances no one should have to face, but speaking up might help change things. Okay, Antonio said. I'll cooperate with the investigation. But right now, I really need to leave. Raymond nodded and personally escorted Antonio to the exit, carrying his medical bag while Kevin carefully transported the recovered instruments in a security bin. The crowd parted for them and several people called out words of support. That was wrong, Doctor. We saw what happened, one man said. I got it all on video, another woman assured him. Crystal clear. That officer should be fired. Antonio acknowledged them with small nods but didn't engage. He was running on fumes now. The adrenaline that had kept him functioning during the confrontation finally wearing off. Every step hurt. His wrist throbbed. His ribs ached. But more than the physical pain was something deeper, a wound that wouldn't show up on any X-ray. He'd spent his life trying to help people. He'd worked himself nearly to death getting through medical school while his mother cleaned houses to help with expenses. He'd done everything right, achieved everything he was supposed to achieve, and still in an airport terminal surrounded by witnesses, he'd been treated like a criminal, not because of anything he'd done, but because of assumptions made in a split second by someone having a bad day. As they reached the exit where a taxi was waiting, Raymond handed him back his bag. Dr. Cruz, for what it's worth, I'm truly sorry. You deserve better than this. Everyone does. Antonio looked at the lieutenant, saw the genuine regret in his eyes, and nodded. Thank you for intervening when you did, and thank you for believing me. I should have been there sooner, Raymond said, and you shouldn't have needed me to believe you. The evidence of who you are was right there in your bag the whole time. Antonio climbed into the taxi and gave the driver his address. As the car pulled away from the terminal, he finally allowed himself to relax slightly.
He pulled out his phone to call his mother, then paused.
What would he tell her? The truth would only worry her. But lying felt wrong too. While he was deliberating, his phone started buzzing with notifications. Text messages from colleagues, emails from friends. Someone had tagged him in a Twitter post. Then another, and another. With a sinking feeling, Antonio opened Twitter and searched his own name. What he found made his breath catch. The videos were everywhere. Justice Forger Cruz was already trending. The story was spreading faster than he could have imagined, taking on a life of its own. His phone rang. It was the dean of Stanford Medical Center. Then a reporter from a local news station. Then someone from a civil rights organization he'd never heard of. The ride home suddenly felt very long, and Antonio realized with a heavy heart that this wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. Antonio's phone didn't stop buzzing the entire ride home. By the time the taxi pulled up to his modest apartment building in Palo Alto, he had 63 missed calls, over 200 text messages, and his social media notifications had climbed into the thousands. He paid the driver with a tired smile, grabbed his luggage with his good hand, and trudged up the stairs to his second-floor apartment. The familiar sight of his front door should have brought relief, but Antonio felt nothing except a bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond the physical. He dropped his bags in the entryway and headed straight for the bathroom, finally catching his reflection in the mirror. There was a scrape on his cheekbone from where his face had hit the airport floor. His shirt collar was stretched and wrinkled from being grabbed. Dark circles under his eyes made him look 10 years older. He'd faced tougher situations before. 18-hour surgeries that tested the limits of human endurance. medical emergencies where seconds meant the difference between life and death. But somehow this felt different. In the operating room, he had control. He had skill and knowledge and tools. At that airport, he'd had nothing except the hope that someone would intervene before things got worse. The shower helped, though the hot water stung the scrapes on his wrists where the handcuffs had bitten into skin. He wrapped his sprained wrist in an elastic bandage with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times for patients. 2 ibuprofen for the pain. A glass of water he forced himself to drink even though he wasn't thirsty. The basic self-care checklist he'd recommend to anyone else. His phone rang again. This time it was his mother. He couldn't avoid this call any longer. Anak, his mother's voice came through using the Tagalog word for child that she'd never stopped calling him. I saw the news. Everyone is calling me. Are you okay? Tell me you're okay. I'm fine, Mama, Antonio said, sitting heavily on his couch. Just tired. Don't lie to me. I saw the videos. That policeman hurt you. You need to go to the hospital. You need to— Mama, I am a hospital. I work at a hospital. I'm a doctor, remember? He tried to inject some humor into his voice, but it fell flat. I checked myself out. Nothing serious. Just bruises. There was a pause on the other end, and he could picture her in her small kitchen, probably making tea even though it was late, the way she always did when she was worried. She'd worked as a nurse before retiring, had seen enough injuries to know that just bruises could mean a lot of different things. This shouldn't have happened to you, she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. You're a good man. You help people. You were helping children in Manila and you come home to this? I know, Mama. Your father, God rest his soul, he always said America would be better for you than it was for us. That your education would protect you. That becoming a doctor would mean respect. She paused. But it didn't matter today, did it? Antonio closed his eyes. His father had died 10 years ago, proud of his son but tired from a lifetime of proving himself in a country that often made him feel like a perpetual outsider. No, Mama, it didn't matter today. They talked for another 20 minutes, his mother's worry gradually transforming into the kind of fierce protective anger that only mothers can muster. She wanted him to sue, to make sure that officer never worked again, to hold press conferences and tell everyone what happened. Antonio listened and made non-committal sounds, too tired to commit to anything beyond getting through the next few hours. After hanging up, he finally looked at his phone properly. The messages ranged from heartfelt support from colleagues to interview requests from major news networks. CNN wanted him on tomorrow morning. The local NBC affiliate had already run a story. The Philippine consulate in San Francisco had issued a statement expressing concern and requesting a full investigation. But it was the Twitter thread that really struck him. Someone had done a deep dive into his background, piecing together his story from public records and news articles. The thread had been shared thousands of times. Thread, who is Dr. Antonio Cruz? The doctor assaulted at SFO Airport today is not just any physician. Here's what Officer Derek Mitchell didn't bother to learn before attacking him. The thread detailed his education, his research publications, his volunteer work across 3 continents. Someone had found a 5-year-old article about him winning a humanitarian award. Another person had shared a video from a medical conference where he'd presented groundbreaking research on minimally invasive heart surgery techniques. A former patient had posted about how Antonio had saved her daughter's life, staying 12 hours past his shift to ensure the surgery was perfect. The comments were overwhelming. Thousands of people expressing outrage, sharing their own stories of profiling and discrimination, demanding justice, but mixed in were the inevitable trolls questioning why he hadn't just complied better, suggesting there must be more to the story, hinting that he'd somehow brought this on himself. Antonio put the phone down. He didn't have the energy for this right now. The next morning came too early, announced by his doorbell ringing insistently at 7. Antonio dragged himself out of bed, his ribs screaming in protest, and checked the peephole. A news van was parked across the street and a reporter stood at his door with a cameraman behind her. He didn't answer. Instead, he texted his department head at Stanford explaining the situation and asking for a few days off. The response came within minutes. Take all the time you need. The university stands behind you completely. We're preparing a statement. By noon, Stanford Medical Center had released that statement. It was stronger than Antonio had expected, condemning the unprovoked assault on a valued member of our medical community. and calling for full accountability and systemic change to prevent such injustices. The university's lawyers had also reached out, offering to represent him pro bono if he decided to file a lawsuit. Antonio appreciated the support, but it also felt surreal. Yesterday, he'd been an ordinary doctor doing his job. Today, he was the center of a national conversation about police conduct and racial profiling. He hadn't asked for this platform, hadn't wanted to become a symbol or a spokesperson. He just wanted to help people and go about his life quietly. His doorbell rang again. This time it was Kevin Park, the officer who'd been Derek's partner at the airport. Antonio was surprised to see him out of uniform, looking uncomfortable and genuinely distressed. "Dr. Cruz," Kevin began, his voice hesitant, "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see right now, but I needed to come and apologize in person. What Derek did was inexcusable, and I should have stopped it sooner." Antonio studied him for a moment, then stepped aside to let him in. They sat in the living room, an awkward silence stretching between them. "I've been on the force for 8 years, Kevin said finally. I've seen Derek have bad days before, seen him get aggressive, but nothing like yesterday. I kept thinking he'd calm down, that he'd realize what he was doing and stop. By the time I understood how serious it was, you were already on the ground. Why did it take that long?" Antonio asked quietly. "You were standing right there the whole time." Kevin looked down at his hands. "Honestly? Because I've been trained to back up my partner, to present a united front, and because calling out another officer, especially in public, feels like the biggest taboo in law enforcement. We're supposed to have each other's backs no matter what, even when your partner is clearly in the wrong, even then. And that's the problem, isn't it?" Kevin looked up, meeting Antonio's eyes. "I've been thinking about this all night. If I'd been watching a video of what happened instead of standing there in the moment, I would have been horrified from the beginning. But in the moment I hesitated. I made excuses. I told myself Derek knew something I didn't, and that hesitation allowed you to be hurt." Antonio appreciated the honesty, even if it didn't change what had happened. "What happens now? To Derek, I mean. He's been suspended pending investigation. Internal Affairs is handling it. And with all the video evidence, there's no way he walks away from this without consequences. But if I'm being honest, Dr. Cruz, the real question is whether those consequences will be meaningful or just for show." Before Antonio could respond, his phone rang. It was Lieutenant Raymond Foster from the airport. "Dr. Cruz, I hope I'm not calling too early. I wanted to update you personally on where things stand. We've officially opened a full investigation into Officer Mitchell's conduct. The district attorney's office has also been notified and is reviewing the case for potential criminal charges." "Criminal charges?" Antonio sat up straighter, wincing at the pull on his ribs. "Assault under color of authority is a serious offense. The video evidence is clear, and we have over 30 witness statements corroborating that you did nothing to provoke or justify the use of force. The DA will make the final call, but between you and me, I think charges are likely." After hanging up, Antonio sat in silence, processing this new development. Kevin was still there, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "I should probably go," Kevin said, standing. "But Dr. Cruz, I meant what I said about the apology, and I want you to know that I'm cooperating fully with the investigation. I've given my statement, and I held nothing back about what Derek did wrong and what I should have done differently." Antonio walked him to the door. "Kevin, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "In all your years on the force, how many times have you seen something like this happen? Maybe not as extreme, but the same basic pattern. Someone gets stopped, questioned, treated roughly for reasons that don't quite add up?" Kevin was quiet for a long moment. "More than I want to admit. And I think that's part of why I hesitated yesterday. On some level, it felt normal. That's what I'm most ashamed of." After Kevin left, Antonio tried to rest, but the news cycle wouldn't let him. His story had gone fully viral now. Major news networks were running segments analyzing the incident. Civil rights organizations were using it as a rallying cry for police reform. The hashtag had evolved from the Justice for Dr. Cruz to $End Airport Profiling, with thousands sharing their own stories of being singled out at security checkpoints. The attention was overwhelming, but something else was happening too. His phone rang with a call from Senator Patricia Lim, a prominent Filipino-American politician he'd never met. "Dr. Cruz, I won't take much of your time, but I wanted to express my support and let you know that I'm calling for congressional hearings on discriminatory practices in airport security." What happened to you is unacceptable, and it's part of a much larger pattern that needs to be addressed. Then came a call from the Philippine ambassador to the United States, expressing the government's concern and offering any assistance he might need. The story had reached the Philippines overnight, where it was front-page news. His volunteer work at Manila Children's Hospital had made him a familiar name there, and the fact that one of their medical heroes had been treated this way in America had struck a nerve. By evening, Antonio's quiet apartment felt like the eye of a hurricane, with chaos swirling all around but temporarily held at bay. He sat on his couch, ice on his wrist, looking at the photographs from Manila that had survived the incident at the airport. Children's faces beaming at the camera, holding up drawings of hearts and thank you signs. This was what mattered, he thought, not the news coverage or the hashtags or the political statements, these kids and the thousands of others he'd helped over the years. This was why he'd become a doctor, but he also knew that what had happened at the airport mattered too, not because it happened to him specifically, but because it happened at all, because it could happen again to someone else who might not have the platform or resources or public support to fight back. His phone buzzed one more time. It was a text from Lieutenant Raymond Foster. The surveillance footage from the airport has been released to the media, the full encounter from multiple angles. I thought you should know before you see it on the news. Antonio turned on his television and found a news channel within seconds. There it was, his worst moment of the past 24 hours playing out in high definition for millions to see. Him being shoved against the wall, falling to the ground, Derek's knee on his back, the scattered medical instruments glinting on the floor. He watched himself on screen, watched the fear and confusion on his own face, and felt a strange disconnect from the person in the video. That was him, but it also wasn't. It was a version of himself stripped of dignity and agency, reduced to a suspect, a problem to be controlled. But what struck him most was what the cameras also captured. The crowd of ordinary people who'd stopped to bear witness. The woman in the business suit who'd spoken up. Kevin's increasing distress as he tried to intervene. The TSA agents' shocked faces. Lieutenant Raymond's swift action once he arrived. For every Derek Mitchell in the world, there were also people who recognized injustice and tried to stop it. Maybe not fast enough, maybe not effectively enough, but they tried. And in a strange way, that gave Antonio hope. Tomorrow he'd decide what to do next. Whether to press charges, give interviews, become the voice for change that everyone seemed to want him to be. Tonight he just needed to rest and remember who he was beyond this incident. A doctor, a son, a person who dedicated his life to healing. The viral videos would fade eventually. The hashtags would trend and then be replaced by the next outrage. But the work of making things better, of ensuring this didn't keep happening, that work would continue long after the news cycle moved on. And Antonio was beginning to realize that he had a choice about whether to be part of that work or not. 3 days after the incident, Antonio sat in a conference room at one of San Francisco's top law firms, surrounded by people in expensive suits who all seemed very interested in his case. Attorney Rebecca Torres had been recommended by Stanford's legal department, and she'd brought along 2 associates and what looked like a mountain of documents. Dr. Cruz, Rebecca began, sliding a tablet across the table to show him a video compilation. In the 72 hours since the incident, we've collected footage from 17 different angles. We have 42 witness statements. We have Officer Mitchell's own body camera footage, which interestingly shows him turning it off during the initial confrontation, then turning it back on only after Lieutenant Foster arrived. Antonio watched the screen without much emotion. He'd seen enough of the videos by now that they'd lost their ability to shock him. What he still couldn't shake was the feeling of helplessness, the memory of cold floor against his cheek. The district attorney's office has indicated they're moving forward with criminal charges, Rebecca continued. Assault under color of authority, civil rights violations, and potentially filing a false report. But that's the criminal side. What we're here to discuss is your civil case. I haven't decided if I want to file a lawsuit, Antonio said quietly. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, studying him with sharp eyes that had probably seen hundreds of clients over the years. May I be frank with you, Dr. Cruz? Please. This isn't just about you anymore. I know that's a lot of pressure to put on someone who just went through a traumatic experience, but it's the truth. The city of San Francisco, the airport authority, and the police department are all watching this case very carefully. How you respond will set a precedent. One of the associates jumped in. We've already documented 7 other complaints against Officer Mitchell that were never properly investigated. Your case could force a systematic review of how complaints are handled, how officers are supervised, how implicit bias training is conducted. Antonio rubbed his temples. His wrist was healing. The swelling had gone down, but it still ached when he moved it certain ways. He had surgery scheduled for next week, a complicated valve replacement that required steady hands and absolute focus. How was he supposed to concentrate on saving someone's life while dealing with all of this? What if I just want to move on, he asked. What if I don't want to be the face of police reform or the symbol of airport profiling? What if I just want to go back to being a doctor? Rebecca's expression softened. Then that's your choice, and we'll respect it. But Dr. Cruz, I've been doing this for 20 years. I've seen countless cases where good people stayed silent because speaking up felt too hard, too public, too exhausting. And you know what happened? The same problems kept occurring. The same officers kept their jobs. The same victims kept suffering. Her words hit harder than Antonio expected. He thought about the children in Manila, how he'd traveled thousands of miles to help kids he'd never met because it was the right thing to do. Was this really any different? Just a different kind of healing? Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Dr. Helen Okafor, the head of cardiothoracic surgery at Stanford and his mentor for the past decade. Turn on CNN, now. Antonio pulled up the news app on his phone and his stomach dropped. Derek Mitchell's lawyer had just held a press conference. The officer sat beside his attorney looking appropriately remorseful, while the lawyer painted a picture that Antonio barely recognized. Officer Mitchell deeply regrets this unfortunate incident, the lawyer was saying. However, we must remember that he was acting in accordance with his training to ensure airport security. Dr. Cruz, while certainly an accomplished professional, exhibited behavior that could reasonably be interpreted as evasive. Officer Mitchell made a split-second decision in a high-pressure environment. Antonio felt his hands clench into fists. Evasive behavior? He'd answered every question, shown his documents, explained himself repeatedly. The only thing he'd done was exist while tired and brown-skinned in an airport. Rebecca was already typing rapidly on her laptop. This changes things. They're going on the offensive, trying to control the narrative before public opinion solidifies completely. We need to respond. How? Antonio asked, his voice tight. Press conference tomorrow. You tell your story in your own words with dignity and clarity. We let the public see who you really are, not who Derek Mitchell's lawyer wants to paint you as. Antonio spent the rest of the day preparing, going over his statement with Rebecca and her team. They wanted him to be emotional but not angry, firm but not aggressive, sympathetic but not weak. It was exhausting.